معالي الوزير، الحضور الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يشرفني أن أرحب بكم اليوم في ثاني جلسة من جلسات حوار الابتكار لدى مركز محمد بن راشد للابتكار الحكومي. أتت جلسات حوار الابتكار لتكون ضمن منظومة عمل المركز، والتي ستربط نخبة من المبتكرين وأفضل الممارسين للابتكارات حول العالم. لنشاهد معا فيديو قصير عن المركز.
يأتي مركز محمد بن راشد للابتكار الحكومي انسجاماً مع الاستراتيجية الوطنية للابتكار التي تهدف إلى أن تكون دولة الإمارات ضمن الدول الأكثر ابتكاراً في العالم، تطبيقاً لرؤية صاحب السمو الشيخ محمد بن راشد آل مكتوم. هدفنا أن يكون الابتكار عادة حكومية وممارسة يومية وثقافة مؤسسية راسخة. نسعى في المركز إلى تحويل الابتكار إلى عمل مؤسسي منظم وترسيخ ثقافة الابتكار في مختلف مجالات العمل الحكومي. ولتوفير أفضل الخدمات والممارسات المبتكرة إلى الجهات الحكومية، يقوم نموذج عملنا إلى 3 ركائز رئيسية هي: أفكار مبتكرة، قدرات مبتكرة، ثقافة مبتكرة. أفكار مبتكرة: الأفكار هي التي تصنع الفرق في العمل الحكومي وتضعنا في المقدمة، لذا نحرص في المركز على اختبار الأفكار المبتكرة من خلال توفير مساحات ابتكار بمعايير عالمية وتنظيم المختبرات الهادفة إلى اقتراح حلول مبتكرة للتحديات التي تواجهها الحكومة. قدرات مبتكرة: لتمكين الكوادر الوطنية من الابتكار نعمل على تدريب الموظفين الحكوميين، ونحرص على توفير منظومة متكاملة من أدوات الابتكار والمواد العلمية والمنهجيات الهادفة إلى تطوير الخدمات الحكومية. ثقافة مبتكرة: حرصاً منا على نشر مفاهيم التميز والإبداع في القطاع الحكومي، نسعى إلى إثراء ثقافة الابتكار في مجتمع الإمارات من خلال الشراكات الدولية، ونطمح للتحول إلى نقطة جذب عالمية للابتكارات وأفضل الممارسات. وبذلك يأتي مركز محمد بن راشد للابتكار الحكومي الأول من نوعه في المنطقة كمبادرة طموحة لتقديم أفضل الخدمات وتعزيز مكانة حكومة.
بروفيسور فرناندو ريمرز هو بروفيسور خبير التعليم في كلية هارفارد، جامعة هارفارد. بروفيسور فرناندو ريمرز هو بروفيسور مؤسسة فورد للتعليم، كرس حياته لخدمة التعليم ونشره حول العالم. بروفيسور فرناندو ريمرز هو عضو في مؤسسات عالمية منها منظمة اليونسكو ومؤسسات أخرى رائدة. Professor Fernando Reimers, it's an honor to have you with us today. Please, we welcome you to the stage. سيتكلم اليوم بروفيسور فرناندو ريمرز عن دور التعليم والابتكار ومهارات القرن ال21.
Thank you very much, Ratha. I have to say I had the pleasure of teaching Shatha, who's one of our graduates and was an excellent student, so you're all very lucky to have her helping you advance your efforts on educational innovation. Thank you very much for the invitation and for your time this morning. I'm going to talk about educational innovation, ibtikar, and about how to make education relevant. I'm going to spend about 30 minutes presenting some ideas with the intent of provoking you, and then hope we'll have 30 minutes for conversation. I understand that some of you, including your minister and vice chancellor, are very active on Twitter. So if, as you're sitting there, anything that I say inspires you to send a tweet, my Twitter is @Fernando Reimers, and if you type something there, I will reply after this talk, and maybe all my students and followers will get in the conversation too. So I'm going to talk about the importance of focusing and of thinking clearly about the purposes of education. I'm going to talk about 21st century competencies and the challenges of advancing 21st century education. So on purpose, last summer, my colleague Clayton Christensen, a professor at the Harvard Business School who has spent 30 years of his life studying innovation, particularly in industry, wrote a very good article published in the Harvard Business Review. And the article synthesized his theory of innovation that says essentially there are two ways companies can improve. One of them is they can become better at the processes which are already in place to produce the things they are producing. He called that sustaining innovation, incremental improvement. They can also, this is the second way, identify needs that are not currently being met, new products that need to be designed, and disrupt existing industry, leapfrog. He calls that disruptive innovation. I think there is an analogy between those two ways to think about improvement and the education sector. To a great extent, I think the efforts of the last couple of decades around the world, certainly in the United States, have been about improving the operations of the school systems. And the theory of improvement is a very simple one. We have defined some standards. We have developed ways to measure performance of students against those standards. And we have created incentives to hold schools accountable so they do better at achieving those standards. Notice nowhere in that theory of improvement is there any question as to whether those are the right standards. But the reality is that the world around the schools keeps changing very, very rapidly. And we need to prepare students not to meet the standards of the past, but to have the skills to invent the future. And so the very question of what are the right standards is the business of leading for relevance, of innovation. And that's what I want to talk about today. And I think there is a great need among education leaders to shift the paradigm, and it is very important to keep in place assessments and processes of ongoing improvement of the systems in place, but we must not abandon the importance of creating the conditions. I see some of you are tweeting already, I hear it in my phone, of creating the conditions, of creating the conditions so that we invent, we design the next set of products. The reason the distinction is important is because the processes that are involved are different, and sometimes the processes that help us improve effectiveness get in the way, impede improving relevance or disrupting. Let me explain what I mean. Improving effectiveness is very much about setting in place, is about activating the analytic mind, the mind that is about understanding a system that is already in place and figuring out a production function and how to optimize that production function. Disruption is about the synthetic mind. It's about design thinking. It's about beginning with a clear sense of what the next product might be and developing a process that can help us prototype and put in place a system of getting towards the production of that product. The second one is a lot more similar to the way the iPhone was developed, for example. The iPhone was not developed by taking the old big cell phones, remember those? You're too young to remember. And trying to figure out how do we produce incremental improvements to that phone. The iPhone was developed through a process of design-based thinking. So let me come back to schools. One of the consequences of these processes designed to improve effectiveness is that they may develop a laser-like focus on certain competencies, right? So is it important to measure? Yes. Any exercise in measurement is an exercise in sampling a particular domain of competencies that one thinks is important. So in Massachusetts, for example, we have a state system of examination of students that basically measures their proficiency in English, mathematics, and science. It is important to measure those things, but those are not the only things that are important. That system doesn't measure initiative. It doesn't measure the capacity to be innovative. It doesn't measure the capacity to get along well with other people, to work in teams. It doesn't measure leadership skills. And all those things are important in a state like Massachusetts that has an innovation-based economy. And so it's important to put measurement in its proper place and understand that it belongs in a paradigm that is about improving the system that is already in place. But if one wants to create the next set of products, we need to figure out how do you build the conditions, how do you create a supportive context, how do you build an ecosystem that actually nourishes innovation rather than kill it. Some argue that if you get too focused on this kind of system, if you don't take these measurements with humility, you dampen, you make it impossible for the innovator to do their work. The only way they can do their work is to go outside the system, in a place that doesn't have these kinds of processes in place. Why is it important to be humble? Because our measurements are very imperfect representations of human talent. I'm going to tell you a story that will make this visible. This is the picture of the Department of Computer Sciences in a little university on the West Coast that nobody has heard about. And it's called the William J. Gates Building of Computer Science. Now, the reason it's named that way is because Bill Gates gave the money, and when Stanford University asked him for the donation, I'm told he only put one condition. And the condition is that this building should be in this location. This location is diagonally across from the mathematics department. And the office in the corner of that department, the office right in front of this building, is the office of a mathematics professor who was a visiting professor at Harvard University when Bill Gates was an undergraduate student. That was the last course that Bill Gates took. He got an F in that course. He took that course in the spring. When he went home that summer, he was busy working with Wozniak, inventing a computer. But that F made him so unhappy that he decided not to come back to the university. And he never finished his undergraduate. So maybe this is the way in which Bill Gates can come back to his old professor and greet him every morning out of the window and say, how do you like me now? Now, the reason this story is important is because that grade that Bill Gates obtained in that course, that F, obviously had zero predictive value in terms of the talent of this man and what he would be able to do with that talent. Now, fortunately, in the United States, the culture is such that it is possible for a dropout from college to still go on and reinvent an entire industry. But imagine if we had a culture where being a dropout of college branded you in such a way as a loser that no one would give you an opportunity or a chance. We would have lost the opportunity to have Microsoft, to have this genius make the contributions that he was able to make. And maybe the professor who gave him the F and others should rethink about how it is that we measure talent and the messages that we send to students. Someone recently interviewed me, a journalist in one of our student newspapers. She wrote an article about college dropouts. And she was asking me, for the students who want to build something, should they drop out of the university? I said, no, they shouldn't drop out. They should find a way for the university to help them build what they want to build. We should take them seriously. We should give them the time. We should connect with them. It's a simple lesson, right? The Gallup organization recently conducted last year a study of 30,000 graduates of college in the United States at different points of their careers. And it asked them a few questions. One question was, are you happy with what you do? And the second question was, how good do you think you are at what you do? And then it asked them, where did you go to school? What was your major? What was the university like? And basically build some models to try to find what were the predictors of self-efficacy and happiness. You know what? It didn't really matter whether students had gone to elite universities or public universities, whether they had studied engineering or business or mathematics. You know the three factors that were the strongest predictors of self-efficacy and happiness? Number one, were you able to engage in a project over an extended period of time that you could call your own? Something that carried over different courses. Maybe it was like Bill Gates, what Bill Gates was doing in the summertime in the garage of his parents, building a computer. Were you able to do something? If you had had that experience, you were 3 times more likely, 5 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later, to be good at what you did and to be satisfied. Number 2, did you meet a professor who took you and your ideas, not their ideas, your ideas, sufficiently seriously to spend time with you, to challenge you, to push your thinking, not to pat you in the head or to destroy you, but to push you to develop your ideas, to take yourself seriously? If you had had that experience, you were 2.5 times more likely 10 years later to be satisfied with what you are doing and to be good at it. Third experience, did you take any class that engaged you with real-world problems? Not to agonize over them, but to think about how you could contribute to solving them. Again, if you had had that experience, you were 2 times more likely than if you had not had that experience. And if you had had those 3 experiences, 5 years out, 10 years out, you were 12 times more likely to be good at what you did and to be happy. And you know what is sad? That the vast majority of the college graduates had not had any of those experiences. What a tragedy. That we have built these wonderful institutions that are universities and that we don't use them to build a culture of makers, to build a society of creators, of innovators, of people who can see problems as an opportunity to solve them. So that's why I wanted to show you this picture of that building at Stanford. Never mind that it's at Stanford. Now, the reason it's especially important to cultivate a mindset of innovation is because technology has changed the world around us in such a way that it is increasingly possible for small groups of people to achieve extraordinary results. Hopefully for the good, but small groups of people can also use their talents and modern means of communication for evil. And part of what education should do is encourage most of them to use their talents to focus on the important problems in this world, which in my mind are 3 big problems. The problems of poverty and inequality that produce exclusion, that limits the human potential of large proportions of the world, and that also are at the root of instability, because everyone is visible. Those people who feel absolutely marginalized and neglected, some of them decide that the only way they're going to improve their lot is to cause harm for others and trouble. So poverty and inequality. Second, sustainability. How do we make sure we relate to the environment in a way that we can pass down a good and healthy planet to our children, to our grandchildren? And number 3, how do we in general create institutions, programs that advance well-being, right? So why can't we align education systems with those goals? Let me give you an example of how the world is changed. This is a group of musicians, hadn't heard about them, from Canada, who some years ago were traveling to give a concert in Colorado. And as one of the musicians is sitting on the plane, he looks outside the window, and he sees that the baggage handlers took his bag and threw it in the conveyor belt. When he arrived in Colorado, the guitar was broken. And so this guy was very unhappy. He wrote a letter to the customer service in United Airlines, and nobody replied. A month later, he wrote another letter. Nobody replied. Wrote a third letter. Nobody replied. So he decided to write a little song. And the song is called United Breaks Guitars. And he sang the song, put it on YouTube, and the song went viral. And within a week, the vice president of United Airlines was on the phone asking him, what do you want? He said, I want you to do 2 things. I want you to replace my guitar, and I want you to teach your bagger handlers to treat baggage carefully. And he achieved that. Now, think for a moment about the meaning of that story. That a small group of 4 people, not well known, could cause a major airline to change its human resources training policy is remarkable. That's why some of you are on Twitter. The vice chancellor is on Twitter because you know you need to be communicating with your students. You don't want the students to be saying the vice chancellor breaks guitars. And you're more likely to be in good terms with them if they know you're listening and you're open to them, right? So this is the world in which we live. And part of what we need to teach our students are the skills to do that. The world in which we live is also a world where we have new ways to produce innovation. Many of you have heard about the X Prize, an invention of a group of venture capitalists and people very interested in innovation who concluded that we needed to accelerate the pace of innovation. And they said, how are we going to do that? We're going to have a grand challenge, and the grand challenge is going to invite people to collaborate in trying to solve some really complicated issues, the kinds of adaptive problems that I was talking about, not technical problems. So one of the challenges was, can we design a shuttle that can be used for private travel to space, which they did. Didn't go very well with Virgin Atlantic, but they're still working on it, right? You've heard the news. Second challenge was, can we find a technology to clean oil spills? They had noticed that in the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico a few years ago, the technology that was used and some of the equipment were the same that had been used when we had the last oil spill on the West Coast in the Exxon Valdez. And they said, why can't we use new technologies, bacteria that eat oil spills? So again, now you know what's interesting about these competitions? That the average team had about 35 people. So think again about that. 35 individuals can, in our age, do what in the past it took large organizations, public and private, like NASA, decades to do. Now, this idea of a competition as an accelerator of innovation is something we're implementing at Harvard University. In my university, over the last 5 years, the president and the leadership have done 3 things because they realize that we need to provide our students the kinds of experiences that the Gallup organization shows produce people who are good at what they do and who are happy. So one of the things that the president of the university began to do, Drew Faust, the first woman to be president of our university, she's terrific, by the way. One of the things that she did was to introduce a president's challenge. And she said, I'm going to give a prize, I'm going to give $100,000 to 3 teams who come up with really innovative ways to address the problems of global education, global health, poverty, water scarcity, and sustainability. And about 300 teams entered the competition, and the only requirements were these teams must not have any professor in them. These must be teams that are student-led. We would be especially happy if the students come from different departments in the university, if they collaborate across disciplines. And they select 10 finalists and then 3 people. But the great thing about this process, about this competition, is not only that there's some really cool ideas. One of the winners 2 years ago was a team that engaged 1 undergraduate, 1 student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and 1 PhD student in physics. And they developed a course, an advanced physics course for self-instruction in an iPad using open source materials. They curated, coded that, and they said, we're going to make it easy for people to take this physics course. I mean, imagine that an undergraduate and a graduate student can produce what in the past only big publishing companies would do. And so what is interesting is that every dean has decided to now have their own competition. So every school at Harvard, groups of students are running their competition. So we have competitions right and left. What is most important is not that some of these people win, is that we now have an ecosystem where many of our students are, from the day one, engaged in the process of inventing something cool that tackles a significant social challenge. So this is the world in which we're living, which causes educational institutions. It's a world in which you carry in your iPhones, in your pocket, not also a tool that allows us to have a parallel conversation to this one online, and I will reply to your tweets if you go to @FernandoRiemers. But you also carry all the knowledge in the world in that tool. If any of you has any question, you say, what is the X Prize? You can go to Wikipedia. Think about Wikipedia for a moment. What a brilliant idea, that someone built a platform that engaged volunteers around the world in codifying all the knowledge. And I'm sure there were many skeptics when Wikipedia was invented that this was going to work, and yet it works remarkably well. I would not want to be in the business of selling encyclopedias today, because a simple solution coded, and imagine if we could do a Wikipedia for education. Imagine if, as you're all embarked in a process of trying to promote innovation in your schools, you said, why don't we engage the talent of all of our teachers? A student in second year of engineering with knowledge of coding can code this platform. So these are some of the opportunities in our world that we have. I'll give you an example on the power of mobiles. In my school, we're very interested in promoting innovation in educational organizations, and we have been working with UNICEF for the last 3 years, trying to help UNICEF become an even better knowledge organization, an innovation organization. And we have designed a 9-month online course, which has the goal of basically developing skills, but also building a network that is capable of collective intelligence. And these UNICEF officers can access this course on their iPhones, because they have to travel. And so they can engage with one another and with us from their iPhones. Who would have told me? We're beginning to think about developing an online program, a global online program, that would similarly be on an iPhone for people who have full-time jobs, who are in any corner of the world, and who will be able to have the kinds of experiences that Shatha and Kevin Caldra, who's with us, another distinguished graduate of our program who works with the Global Business Coalition for Education in the UN, the kind of experience that they had at Harvard. These are all the possibilities. This is not science fiction. This is today. We can do these things today. Now, we have important needs in the world. The need of teaching people. I was talking about big challenges. That's a third one, obviously. Poverty, sustainability, allowing people to relate across lines of difference, cultural difference, religious difference, ethnic difference, contributing to sustainable development. Now, what would it mean to develop the competencies that I have been talking about? It's certainly not about providing more knowledge of facts, because why would you want to do that when you can access them on your iPhone, right? So I'm working with my colleague, Dr. Connie Chung, who's here with us and who's the Director of Research of the Global Education Innovation Initiative, in a large, ambitious project which I describe as the Genome Project of 21st Century Education. We want to sequence the DNA of 21st century education around the world. And we have finished the first exercise where we have looked at the best existing research on what are the skills that people need in the 21st century to be producers, to be doers, to be people who have a mindset to see problems as an opportunity and produce the kinds of designs that can be presented at these different challenges. And we have just finished a first book that examines 21st century education in Singapore and in China, in India, in the United States, in Mexico, and in Chile. And we're now beginning to study programs that build the capacity of school leaders and teachers to teach that education. And so we have used the following framework to identify those practices. We have said 21st century skills, and we're drawing on work synthesized by the National Research Council in the United States that summarize about 20 years of research on what are the skills that matter for people. So obviously some of those skills are cognitive skills. Some of them are relational skills, the capacity to relate to other people. And some of these are the capacity to know oneself and to govern oneself. Now we have, in this Global Education Innovation Initiative, we have built a research partnership with colleagues in 6 countries. And my colleagues in India tell me, these are not 21st century, Fernando, these are 6th century BC. We have always known that these skills are important. It's just that we forgot about them. We have become so obsessed with testing 2 or 3 things that we forgot that self-knowledge is important. So he may be right, but I'm going to use the term 21st century skills to refer to these. And so what do we mean by cognitive skills? Well, we mean 3 things. We certainly mean knowledge. It's important to have knowledge of facts. It's very difficult to think and process that knowledge if you don't know the facts. But if you only know the facts, you don't really have much of a capacity to contribute to an innovation economy. You also need to have skills, the capacity to use that knowledge to solve problems. And I would argue that most education systems around the world are certainly emphasizing knowledge, and the best ones are emphasizing cognitive skills, the use of that knowledge to solve problems. And that's all most of them are doing. Very few are also promoting creativity and innovation. I would have to admit that the reason I'm so excited about these initiatives at Harvard to promote innovation, such as the Innovation Initiative, is because for most of our almost 400 years history, we haven't been doing that. We have been largely lecturing. And we realized we had to stop doing that when the students stopped coming to class and saying, I don't need to bother. I can read that stuff in a book. Most of my learning comes from doing the problem sets, the P sets, not from listening to the professor. But that's only one of the blocks, right? Now, what do I mean by processing and cognitive strategies? Well, the kinds of things that those of you working in education are thinking about, right? Critical thinking, problem solving, analysis, logical reasoning, interpretation, capacity to make decisions, and executive functioning, increasingly important, the capacity for self-regulation and to organize yourself and your time to get something done. What do I mean by knowledge? Well, the basic literacies, but also information literacies, right? Knowledge of the disciplines, ability to use evidence, and so on. And what do I mean about creativity? I mean the capacity to think outside the box, the capacity to engage in design-based thinking, and to not be paralyzed by overanalysis that paralyzes you. But that's only one bucket. The other bucket has to do with the capacity to work with other people. And that includes two big categories, the capacity to collaborate and the capacity to lead and to influence. So collaboration, what does that include? Communication, teamwork, cooperation, coordination, interpersonal skills, the capacity to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. I was here at a conference, and I went to a reception, and a woman, a school principal, forget her name, Karen, forget her last name, a school principal in London, as she was meeting me, did something that showed me what being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes are. She said, I was asking her a question about the education of leaders in England, and she said, tell me where you come from so that I can explain these in a way you would understand. And I thought, what a brilliant capacity of perspective taking. She knows that if she doesn't have a framework of where I come from, she's going to talk, and I'm not going to understand, right? So perspective taking, trust, how important this is. How do you get anything done? We live in a world where increasingly we have to collaborate with others that we meet on short notice, oftentimes virtually, and you need to have enough trust to actually get something done. Service orientation, capacity to resolve conflicts, and negotiations. All these things can be taught. I would argue most education systems don't teach those things. And if they teach them, it's not when they teach academic subject matter. They teach them in sports, when students engage in the arts, in music, particularly in performing arts, when they have the opportunity to work with others in what we typically call extracurricular, which, by the way, is getting increasingly difficult to do because we have such an obsession with the things that we're now measuring that we don't realize how important all these other skills are to produce well-rounded and balanced human beings who can work with others. There is a recent book written by a journalist popularizing the findings of the PISA study. And one of her conclusions is an example of the dangers of a paradigm that is about improving technical efficiency and how it may blind us from developing the capacity for innovation. She says, the high-performing countries spend almost no time in sports, in contrast to the US, where we revere our athletes, our coaches, and maybe we should spend less time on sports. Now, I have two sons, and one of them is an athlete. And so I have watched more basketball games in my life than I thought I ever would. But as I have watched those using the 21st century skills, I realize these coaches are the ones who are teaching these skills. They are teaching, last week, I should be allowed to brag, my son, the athlete, received a sportsmanship award. And when the coach described why he was getting it, he was listing these qualities. He was saying he knows how to do these things. Now, my kid does well in the academics, but doing well in the academics has nothing to do with this. has more to do with knowing your facts and having the capacity to process those facts. You could be a very selfish person, a very awkward person who cannot relate to others and do very well in academics and be a valedictorian in the class. And if we only produce people like that, we would have a problem because they would be incapable of joining others and producing anything of value. Now, leadership, what do I mean? Well, the capacity to engage with others, to communicate, and so on. And then what do I mean by self-knowledge? 3 things. The capacity to suspend belief, to say, well, maybe my point of view is not the only point of view, certain work ethic, responsibility, trying hard, and self-efficacy. And so what do I mean by intellectual openness? Things of this sort, right? Taking responsibility, intercultural competency, what this principle from London displayed, appreciation for diversity, adaptability, the capacity to learn every day, intellectual interest, work ethic. What does that include? Initiative, self-direction, perseverance. Now, what's important is that all these things can be taught if we are intentional about it. They shouldn't be byproducts of an education. They shouldn't be something that you learn if you are lucky enough to have a good coach or a good teacher. They should be a piece of the curriculum. And then self-efficacy, the capacity to regulate yourself and to monitor and take care of your physical and mental health. Now, what are the challenges of designing an education that can teach those things? Well, there are challenges of designing, implementing, and bringing it to scale. I'll just mention them because I want to have some time for some exchange. So design, what does it mean? We need to be able to begin with the end in mind and to identify what does good performance look like? What do we want the students to know, to be able to do, and to care about that reflects these competencies? What should be the content? What is the right sequence? How do we teach it? How do we depend on new pedagogies, project-based learning, robotics, coding? But we should be intentional. Oftentimes I see too many people who want to join the innovation bandwagon and they add things to the curriculum without thinking clearly about what you hope to get in the end. So how are they going to be able to put processes of corrective improvement if you don't know what the end goal is, right? As Alice in Wonderland says in the book, when she gets to that intersection and asks the cat, which way should I go, east or west? The cat says, well, where do you want to go? She says, I don't know. She says, well, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. I think it is increasingly important in education that we are intentional about where we want to go. And if where we want to go is to build an innovation economy and to align the education system with the production of a culture of makers, then we should be thinking clearly about the outcomes of such an education system, and everything else should be mapped backwards from that clarity. Now, of course, design is only a piece of the puzzle. Execution is 90% of the story. And that means, how do we change the culture of parents? One of the countries I work in is China. And all these parents, many parents want their kids to go to good universities. And to go to good universities, they have to pass the Gaokao. So the most innovative educators are saying, well, how do we do all these things you're talking about and still make sure the kids get a good score on the Gaokao? Because if not, the parents are going to be unhappy. So we have to work with the parents to make sure they support these. And then finally, of course, there are challenges of bringing that to scale. It's not very difficult. We're not very good in the US at this. I think we have a lot of good 21st century education on a small scale. We have networks. The challenge is to accelerate the process of bringing this to scale and for everybody. And on that note, maybe I should pause here. I apologize. I'm still too much of a 20th century teacher. And even when I know that it's not very effective, I talk too much when I should be listening more. But I hope we have some time to get your questions and your comments and your reactions. And if you don't get a chance to chime in, tweet at Fernando Reimers, and I will reply. And we'll have thousands of people following our exchange.
You mentioned Bill Gates, and he might be taken as representative of a lot of other innovators, whether Steve Jobs or others. My question goes then to what you were discussing about design and beginning with the end in mind. We all know that it's notoriously difficult to measure things like innovation and innovative ability, and yet our schools, including universities, are designed to measure things. I mean, we say something about a graduate when he or she leaves the university. And perhaps we need to get to the point where we think about innovation not as a discrete discipline or behavior, but as an ecosystem. But my question then is, given the fact that true innovators are rarely the products of structured learning, and universities are built to structure learning somehow, how do we take lessons from people like Bill Gates and build them into institutions that are culturally and by the requirements of their overseers, accreditors, and so on, required to have a great deal of structure to measure outcomes and so on? How do we build an ecosystem that does both?
It's a great question, and I agree with some of the premises and disagree with others. So let me explain that in my answer. I agree that the challenges of measurement are challenges that we need to address. Now, some people often ask me, should we not measure? I say no. I think that it is absolutely valuable to have, we should not confuse accountability with measurement. We need to have, and we shouldn't confuse measurement with standardized systems of student competency. I think we absolutely need accountability in any kind of institution, and I think that systems of both formative and summative evaluation are essential. It's the only way we can get better. If we're going to build a culture of continuous improvement, we need those things. Now, oftentimes, there are very simple ways of obtaining feedback that we don't utilize. I'm going to give you 2 examples. I teach a course on educational innovation at the Harvard iLab, and one of the things we do is we ask my students several times during the semester, how are things, we send them a little survey, how are things going for you? And we have a little smiley, and they can put a dial that tells us how well, and then we say, what could we be doing to make this course more valuable for you? So that's an example of a feedback mechanism that is not measurement, but it's incredibly valuable to the teaching team so that we can tailor instruction to our students. And just like that, there are other forms of feedback that any education system can use. I have a colleague in Canada, Doug Wilms, that concluded that many of the standardized assessment systems of student performance had very little influence, very little translation into processes to improve the capacity of teachers. He said, how about if we measure something else? How about if we measure classroom climate? So he designed a system where every month he sends a survey to a sample of students in every classroom in New Brunswick. His name is Douglas Wilms. And the survey has 10 questions, basically. Do you think the teacher cares about your learning? Do you get answers to your questions? Do you feel challenged? He asks those questions on a Friday. By Monday, the teacher gets a report that tells them what her or his students think and how that compares to other similar schools and to other schools in the province. And the impact of that kind of feedback on a teacher on a monthly basis is much greater than getting feedback on the performance of your students on a test when you're never going to see those students again. So accountability is important. We should build many feedback loops in any organization that tries to learn. And it is also important to measure student learning. But we should use those data well. So the first thing we should remember is what domain is this measuring? So I mentioned in Massachusetts, what we measure for the system as a whole is mathematics, language, and science. Is it important? Yes. Do we want to do better on those domains? Yes. We should know the limitations of those assessments. We should know that they do not measure innovation and creativity, and they do not measure self-knowledge and relationship skills, and we should be attentive that we should cultivate those processes. One of the worst misuses of assessments that I have seen on a global scale is a global movement that thought it would be a bright idea that we could accelerate the process of improving educational opportunity if we found a way to measure early literacy. And then we develop a test that basically measures how many words per minute a kid can read. Now, is that useful to measure literacy? Yes. But when that becomes the driver of your reform, and that's all you care about, this is terrible. Because you can make kids read a lot of words per minute and hate reading. And you know what's going to happen with those kids who don't learn to love how to read? That as soon as they can leave that school, either mentally or physically, they will. And they will not become lifelong readers. And so, is it good to measure? Yes. Now, the piece where I disagree with you is the notion that creativity is the result of a more or less random process or of a process that we don't understand very well and unstructured. I agree that the structures that we have in place may not be very good to cultivate creativity. That doesn't mean that I think that creativity is the result of a highly structured process that permits creativity. It has nothing to do with chaos, has nothing to do with anarchy. For example, the creation at Harvard, one of the things that we have done is the creation of a Harvard Innovation Center. It's a very simple thing. It says in order to be creative, people need a space in which they're going to be working, because creativity is the result of hard work. It's not the result of waking up one morning and being inspired. It's the result of taking a problem and becoming so obsessed with that problem that you work on it 24/7. We said, well, we need to give a space where students can work 24/7. That is safe, that is comfortable, that maybe will inspire them. So we got an old building, we bought a television station, they went somewhere else, we gutted the building, and we painted it with bright colors and put very nice furniture that is inspiring, and we told the students, you want to work on a cool project? Come here. This is going to be open 24/7. We're going to give you good food. We're going to give you good coffee. We're going to have shuttle buses that will take you to your dorms at any time of the day and night. That's an example of how you can build a structure that supports creativity. The other thing we have done is to encourage the creation of a lot of extracurricular activities designed to do that. So at Harvard, for example, we have for undergraduates a group called Hack Harvard. And Hack Harvard is a voluntary association of undergraduates, mostly computer science majors, interested in computers and business. So what does that do? It gives them a community. It gives them a community that connects them not only to each other, but to the outside world. They talk to venture capitalists, they talk to graduates who are involved creating things. So I agree that we need to engage in a process of redesign of educational institutions if our goal is to cultivate some of these competencies, so that creativity becomes not the lucky result of someone who was able to find that at home, but the expected, the predictable outcome of an institution who set out to produce that. Thanks for a great question. Yeah, yes.
There is a word there, if we can just focus on and unpack a little bit, the word of curiosity.
Yes.
And some argue that curiosity is a prerequisite to innovation.
Yeah, of course.
Ask questions.
You bet. You bet.
And that's what actually makes us different than any other living species. We have that in our DNA.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Harvard Innovation Lab.
Yeah.
And there was a study that just came out recently.
Yeah, 5 years ago.
Wagner, yeah. That said, kids in their schooling career, when you start KG1, H4, on an average, kids would ask 100 questions per day. All kinds of questions, up and down, right and left. Halfway in their schooling career, at grade 6.
They only ask 10.
Exactly. I don't know how many questions we ask ourselves. So we have this education system that, sorry to use the word, kill curiosity. Now, I'm just interested to see how can we shift the paradigm of an education system that is so focused on giving answers to one that promote asking questions and asking unasked questions and trying to find new answers to that, because I think this would actually be very helpful to the curiosity.
I think it's a great question. Suppose in your question is implicit the answer to the question itself. We need to build an education system that honors the capacity of students to ask questions, that gives them assignments that allow the development of that curiosity. In the 1950s, there were a number of developments in public health that had a big influence in how long people lived. And that would be the end of the story. But for most kids, that's probably something they would forget. Knowing that is probably not very relevant because you can find that in Wikipedia. Instead, what Ms. Lajic did was to get the kids, give them an activity that engaged them to understand that science is not knowledge that somebody passes down to you, is a process of creation and of engaging in dialogue with other people who are doing the same thing, and of agreeing to follow certain rules in using evidence to support the conclusions that you reach about some hypothesis. I mean, this woman is a genius. I have just nominated her for a big award. She is remarkable in how she teaches, but this is not the only thing she does. She is tough like hell. I mean, students know that this is the hardest work they will ever take. Some people know it. Her reputation precedes her. They say, well, I'm going to have to be careful with what I take because I want to take Miss Logic's course. And Miss Logic course, you know, she's not someone who's going to pat you in the head. She's going to be one of those teachers who's going to take you so seriously that you're going to want to do your best work for her. Why are you going to do that? Because you know she loves you. And you know she loves science. And it is because she loves that she's going to push you to do your best. My second son, who's really into science, used to come to her class is the first class, 20 minutes early. So just so he could sit there and talk to the woman. And you know what? She honored his questions. He was reading things on the brain, which is not covered. He was interested in the brain. He was always curious. So there are simple things that we can do. I don't think we need an innovation lab in how we teach ordinary subjects that will cultivate that curiosity, that would discipline the curiosity, that would teach people to develop these skills. So for my second son, who wants to be a neuroscientist, most of the facts that he learned right now are probably going to change because we're just beginning to understand the brain. But the habits of mind that he developed in her class, how he pushed himself to do his best because he knew his teacher loved him and was challenging him, that he will carry for the rest of his career and of his life. So I think we can do that in all subjects.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all very much for coming.